The slug was 2 centimeters from her cheek when it turned to dust. Nobody screamed. That was the wrong detail. A hypervelocity boarding round had just been fired through a bridge viewport that should not have survived the impact, and the only sound on the Rustlark's command deck was the soft, bored exhale of Captain Odessa Kale, who had not moved her feet in 6 minutes of pretending to be harmless and did not intend to start now. Inspector General Thrisk was still screaming, though, his breather mask fogged white with every panicked breath, and the cyan light under his skin pulsed so fast it looked like a warning strobe. He had come aboard to write up a haulage crew for thermal violations. He had not come aboard for this. Odessa's hand hovered over a dial that looked, to any untrained eye, like a navigation trim wheel. It was not a navigation trim wheel. She had turned it a quarter inch, no more, and the round that should have opened her skull had simply stopped existing between one heartbeat and the next, folded down into a fine grey powder that drifted, weightless, past her jaw. The glass pendant at her throat did not so much as tremble. The deck plates under her boots were still shuddering from the impact. The glass didn't even rattle. She saw it come. She waited one breath longer than any sane person would. She crushed it before it crossed the last meter. Thrisk's datapad slid out of his 3-fingered grip and clattered against the deck, forgotten. Behind him, through the scarred viewport, 2 more Vorus cruisers were rotating their targeting arrays toward the hull, patient and unhurried, the way predators move when they believe the prey has nowhere left to run. Odessa didn't look at the pad. She didn't look at Thrisk. She looked past him, at the ships lining up their next shot, and for the first time since he'd boarded her ship, something in her expression actually changed. It wasn't fear, it was closer to irritation. She wasn't finished pretending, not yet. Whatever she does next, you'll want to be there for it. 6 minutes earlier, the docking clamp had barely finished sealing when Inspector General Thrisk marched up the Rustlark's boarding ramp, breather hissing, datapad already scrolling through a list of violations he hadn't found yet. Captain Kale, he said her name like an accusation, Void Transit Authority, your thermal signature registers 400% above standard for a vessel of this cargo class. I am authorized to inspect your reactor core, your manifest, and any compartment I deem relevant. Step lightly on the deck plating, Inspector, Odessa said, not moving from where she leaned against the bulkhead. Gravity calibrator runs hot when we carry heavy burdens. That is not an answer. It's the only one you're getting for free. Behind her, a wrench sailed end over end across the corridor and landed, with a clang, in a toolbox 8 feet away without anyone appearing to have aimed it. Thrisk's head snapped toward the sound. A broad-shouldered man named Garrick caught the box's lid on the bounce and didn't even glance up from the panel he was rewiring. Thrisk's monitors ticked upward. He made a note. Unsecured tools during transit is a Class 2 infraction. Write it up, Odessa said. We've got a drawer full of your Class 2s. Keeps the paper jam from getting lonely. She led him deeper into the ship, past a woman named Rhea, who was asleep sitting upright on top of a running generator, one boot propped against the housing, snoring through the vibration like it was a lullaby. Thrisk stopped walking. Is that safe? Rhea sleeps best near the hum. Some people count sheep. Odessa kept walking. You want the engine bay or not, Inspector? He wanted the engine bay. The reactor chamber was a mess of exposed conduit and dented plating, lit orange by warning strips that should have meant something was failing and instead meant nothing at all, because on the Rustlark, the warnings had been failing for years and everyone had stopped listening to them on purpose. Thrisk's breather clicked as he scanned the output readout, and for 1/2 second, a number flickered across the display that had no business being there. Then Odessa's palm was flat against the panel, blocking it, casual as a woman leaning on a bar. Output's been unstable since the last coolant swap, she said. Engineer keeps meaning to file the paperwork. That reading, Thrisk said slowly, did not resemble a coolant fault. Lot of things don't resemble what they are out here. He wrote something down. His bioluminescence had gone from steady cyan to a nervous flicker, though he seemed to think no one had noticed. A man near the reactor housing, thin and quiet, had a headset clamped over one ear, tuned to something that wasn't ship traffic. Thrisk gestured at him. That crewman, Sealers, why is he monitoring an unregistered frequency? Sealers likes music, Odessa said. It's a long haul out here. That is not music. That is encrypted long-range static. To you, maybe. Thrisk's mask fogged faster. He turned back to his datapad, scrolling through a violation checklist that kept growing and somehow never landing anywhere solid enough to act on. He found the biological containment clause next, pointed his scanner at a sealed canister near the galley hatch, and the readout screamed a containment breach warning loud enough to make him flinch. That is unregistered biological hazard material. Rhea, awake now and eating out of the canister with a spoon, didn't look up. That's my lunch. It registers as. It's fermented. It's supposed to smell like that. Thrisk stared at the canister, then at Rhea, then at Odessa, and something in his posture suggested he was beginning to suspect the entire crew had been assembled specifically to make him feel insane. He was not wrong, though he didn't know that yet. What he knew was that his checklist had 4 open violations, none of which he could actually enforce without a full audit he did not have clearance to order, and a growing, wordless unease that no amount of regulation had a category for. Captain, he said, lowering the datapad, I want the hyperdrive logs, all of them, now. They expected a terrified crew begging for a rescue, Odessa said, almost to herself, watching him. Instead, they got a demolition team annoyed by the interruption. What? Nothing, follow me. They never made it to the drive logs. The collision alarm didn't build. It didn't warn. 1 second the corridor was quiet, except for Rhea's spoon scraping the canister, and the next, every light on the Rustlark snapped red, and a proximity klaxon tore through the ship loud enough to rattle Thrisk's mask against his face. Garrick's wrench stopped mid-spin in his hand. Sealers ripped the headset off. Rhea was on her feet before the second alarm cycle finished. On the bridge, the main display filled with contact icons, dozens of them, dropping out of stealth in a jagged crescent formation that Thrisk recognized before Odessa said a single word about it. His mask fogged white. That's a Vorus Iron Fleet. The Vorus formation held at optimal boarding range, jagged hulls catching the starlight like broken teeth, and the comms screamed open with a demand translated into flat, mechanical trade common. Surrender cargo and crew. No second transmission will follow. Thrisk grabbed the console edge. Captain, you need to trigger the civilian distress beacon. Now, standard protocol requires immediate compliance with a boarding demand of this class. We surrender the manifest, We're not doing that, Odessa said. It is the law. It's a suggestion for people who don't have better options. She reached past him and muted the channel with 2 fingers, the same casual motion she'd used to wave off his violation checklist an hour earlier. The silence that followed was worse than the alarm had been. Something changed in the room. Thrisk felt it before he understood it. Garrick set the wrench down instead of dropping it. Rhea's spoon was already gone, her hands empty and still at her sides. Sealers hadn't moved from the comm station, but his shoulders had squared in a way that made the thin fabric of his jumpsuit look, suddenly, like it was covering something built for other work. Pilot, Odessa said, not raising her voice. Direct intercept on the lead ship. Give me a burn window. Odessa, Thrisk said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the rank in front of it. That is a full Iron Fleet formation. 7 vessels. You are 1 freighter. I'm aware of the math, Inspector. Then you understand this is suicide. She didn't answer that. She was watching the tactical display, and for the first time since he'd boarded, Thrisk saw something in her face that had no bureaucratic category at all. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't fear either. It was the flat, unhurried attention of someone doing long division. The lead Vorus cruiser broke formation first, arcing wide to bring its boarding harpoon array to bear on the Rustlark's bridge. Thrisk's breather clicked faster, fogging the inside of his mask in short, panicked bursts. They're not going to talk, he said. They never talk twice. I know. You know. Everyone out here knows the Vorus, Inspector. That's not new information. She glanced at him, and there was something almost gentle in it, the way you'd explain something simple to someone who was about to be very frightened. The only thing new here is you. The cruiser fired. It wasn't a warning shot. A hypervelocity slug tore across the gap between the ships too fast for the eye to properly track, aimed dead center at the viewport. And this was the moment, the one from before, the one already spent, where Odessa's hand found the dial that wasn't a navigation trim wheel, and the round became dust 2 centimeters from her cheek. Thrisk's datapad hit the deck. He did not pick it up. He couldn't. His hands had stopped answering him. He had spent 6 years auditing merchant vessels across 4 sectors. He had memorized the tolerances of civilian hull plating, the maximum yield of registered cargo lasers, the precise threshold at which a navigational system could be legally modified before it required a military permit. None of it explained what he had just watched. A woman had reached out, almost lazily, and unmade a weapon designed to punch through 3 meters of reinforced alloy. That was not, he said, and his voice cracked in a register his translator struggled to render, a navigation system. No, Odessa agreed, it wasn't. Garrick was already moving, hauling a floor panel up with one hand like it weighed nothing, exposing a bank of controls that had no registration markings, no VTA compliance stamp, nothing that belonged on a haulage manifest anywhere in the sector. Rhea had vanished from the bridge entirely, and somewhere below decks Thrisk could hear heavy machinery spinning up, a sound with a pitch he recognized from exactly one context, weapons-grade capacitor charge. Every one of you, Thrisk whispered, backing against the bulkhead. Every single one of you aboard this ship. He looked at Garrick's forearms, the old pale lines crossing the skin that he'd assumed, an hour ago, were industrial burn scars. He looked at Sealers, whose eyes hadn't left the tactical display since the alarm sounded, calm in a way that civilians simply did not get calm during a Vorus boarding action. He looked, last, at Odessa, and for one full second, his cyan bioluminescence didn't just flicker. It froze, then flared white-hot beneath his skin, a full-spectrum panic response his own biology wasn't built to hide. Because he understood, all at once and completely, that the checklist in his hand had been auditing the wrong thing from the very start. He had been looking for smugglers. He had been looking for unregistered cargo, unpaid tariffs, a captain skimming fuel credits off a shipping manifest. He had never once considered that the ship itself might be the violation. That an entire merchant fleet, spread across 100 trade routes he personally certified as harmless, might be exactly what it looked like right up until the moment it stopped pretending. "You're not haulers," he said. It came out as barely more than air through the breather. "None of you are haulers." "The freight pays for the fuel," Odessa said, watching the second cruiser adjust its approach vector. "The quiet pays for my temper." "Do not confuse our patience with your superiority," she thought, though she didn't say it aloud, not yet. There would be time for that later, if there needed to be a later worth explaining anything to. The second slug came in low, aimed at the engine housing this time, a smarter shot than the first. Odessa didn't reach for the dial. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward Sealers. "Now," she said. Sealers' hands moved across the console in a pattern that had nothing to do with comms, and somewhere deep in the ship's belly, the reactor shackles Odessa had spent the last hour hiding from a bureaucrat's scanner, released with a groan of metal that shook the whole hull. Thrisk felt it in his teeth. The lights along the corridor dimmed once, then surged brighter than before, fed by something that had been sitting coiled and starved under 6 years of falsified compliance reports. "What," Thrisk managed, "did you just do?" "Turn the ship back on," Odessa said. "It's been running with the parking brake up since before you boarded, Inspector. Seemed rude to show you the real numbers before you'd finished your paperwork." Outside, the second slug reached the hull. It didn't hit dust this time. It hit a sheer field wide enough to catch the whole bow, and the impact folded the round sideways into a spray of molten alloy that sparked harmlessly off the reinforced plating, close enough that Thrisk saw it through the viewport, close enough that some animal part of his brain understood he had been standing 3 meters from his own death and hadn't known it. The Vorus flagship began adjusting its approach again, slower now, its targeting array pausing in a way that Odessa read immediately as hesitation. Good. Let them hesitate. Hesitation was the only currency that mattered in the next 90 seconds. She reached up without thinking about it and touched the glass pendant at her throat. Still cool, still silent. The obsidian lily inside hadn't so much as shifted since the first alarm sounded, and some old, quiet part of her found that steadying the way it always did. "Pilot," she said, "bring us about, full profile." The Rustlark's engines, no longer shackled, no longer pretending to be a tired old bulk freighter limping between contract stops, answered with a shudder that Thrisk felt in the marrow of his bones, the sound of a ship shedding 6 years of disguise in a single breath. Behind him, Rhea's voice crackled over the internal comm, flat and businesslike. "Core's hot, Captain. She's ready whenever you are." Thrisk looked at the tactical display, at 7 Vorus warships closing on what he now understood, with total and sickening clarity, was not a freighter at all. He looked at Odessa's calm, unbothered profile lit orange by the reactor readout behind her, and the last piece of his checklist, the part of him that still believed regulation could explain what he was watching, finally gave out. "What are you people?" he whispered. Odessa didn't answer. She was already counting the range to the lead cruiser. She didn't get the chance to answer him because the ship answered for her. The Rustlark surged forward, and Thrisk's knees buckled against an acceleration that no registered civilian dampener field should have absorbed without crushing every soft-bodied thing aboard into paste. He caught the console rail, dragged himself upright, and found Odessa standing exactly where she'd been standing, unmoved, unbothered, watching the lead cruiser grow larger on the display. "Belay full profile," she said. "Angle us through the gap between the second and third ship. Garrick, mining array status." "Charged and screaming for it," Garrick called back, voice carrying up through the open floor panel. Thrisk grabbed for something to say that would matter, some scrap of authority he still had a right to invoke. "You cannot fire on a Vorus vessel without provocation. That constitutes an act of—" "They shot at us twice," Odessa said, not looking at him. "That's the provocation. You wrote the report yourself, Inspector, or were you not paying attention when the slug came through the viewport?" He had no answer for that. He had stopped having answers 3 exchanges ago, and some new, colder part of him understood that his job here was no longer to regulate anything. It was simply to survive it and remember what he'd seen. The lead cruiser fired a spread this time, 4 rounds instead of 1, fanned wide to force a choice. Odessa didn't flinch. She tapped a sequence on the console, short and precise, and the ship's sheer field bloomed outward in a shape that had nothing to do with any navigational system Thrisk had ever certified. 3 of the rounds folded into dust. The 4th she let through on purpose, angled just enough that it clipped the Rustlark's outer hull plating and screamed off into the dark, a controlled loss she'd apparently already priced in. "Why did you let that one hit?" he demanded. "Cheaper than burning more power stopping it. That plate's due for replacement anyway." It was such an ordinary answer, delivered with such ordinary boredom, that Thrisk felt something in his chest twist sideways. She was doing math. Somewhere behind her calm face, she was running the same kind of cost analysis he used on requisition forms, except the units weren't credits. They were incoming naval ordnance. Below decks, the Singularity Core's charge whine climbed another register, a sound Thrisk felt more than heard, vibrating up through the bulkhead into his back teeth. 90 seconds to full discharge, Rhea reported over the comm, flat as a shipping manifest. Odessa didn't answer her either. She was watching the lead cruiser's formation start to widen, the first crack of doubt in 7 ships that had, until now, moved like a single organism. Good. She wanted them doubting. Doubt slowed reaction time, and reaction time was the only thing standing between the Rustlark and a clean kill. She reached up and touched the pendant at her throat, an old habit that had nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with staying steady inside it. The lily hadn't moved once through any of this. Neither had she. "Do not confuse our patience with your superiority," she said, quiet mostly to herself, the words she'd been sitting on since the muted channel. This time she didn't hold them back. She kicked the comm live and let the Vorus flagship hear it, flat and unbothered, before cutting the feed again. Thrisk watched the tactical display flicker as the lead ship's targeting solutions stuttered, recalculated, stuttered again. Something about the transmission had cost them a full second of certainty. A full second, against a weapon that fired faster than sound, was an eternity. "They're slowing their approach," he said, and it came out half question, half confession. It was the first thing he'd said in minutes that wasn't a regulation. "They should," Odessa said. "Smart of them. It wasn't going to save them." Behind Thrisk, the internal comm crackled, and for a moment he expected Rhea's countdown again. Instead it was Sealer's, and his voice carried a different weight than anything Thrisk had heard from the crew so far, careful in a way that suggested he was choosing not to say more than he had to. "Captain," picking up chatter on the Vorus command channel, "they flagged us before they ever dropped out of stealth. Something in their own logs already had us marked." Odessa's jaw tightened, just barely, the first crack in her own composure since the boarding began. "Marked how?" "Can't tell yet, but it wasn't random. They didn't stumble onto a freighter. They came looking for one." The words sat in the air a moment too long. Thrisk felt the shape of it before he understood it, the same way he'd felt the sheer field before he'd seen it work. Something larger than this one engagement, something that made the Rustlark's disguise less a lucky trick and more a single loose thread in a pattern he hadn't been shown yet. "That's not possible," he said. "The VTA registry lists this vessel as a Class 4 bulk hauler, independently owned. Nothing about it would draw targeted attention from an Iron Fleet." "No," Odessa agreed, and there was something new in her voice now, something that wasn't boredom anymore. "It wouldn't, unless they weren't hunting this ship specifically." Thrisk looked at her. Then what were they hunting? She didn't answer right away. On the display, the 7 Vorus vessels had stopped their slow, confident crawl entirely, hanging dead in space at the edge of engagement range, weapons still hot, but no longer advancing, as if some instruction from further up their own chain of command had just told them to wait. "They think we're one of many," Odessa said finally. "That's what the hesitation means. They're not just afraid of what this ship can do. They're afraid of how many more of us might be sitting out there right now, wearing the same disguise, waiting on the same trade route." Thrisk's mask fogged over completely, and for a long moment he didn't wipe it clear. Garrick's voice came up through the floor panel, calm as a man announcing lunch. "Reactors stable at full output, Captain, whenever you're ready." Odessa didn't move yet. She was still looking at the frozen Vorus formation, at 7 ships full of soldiers who had just realized, in real time, that the math they'd been given before the mission might have been catastrophically incomplete. "Not yet," she said. "Let them sit with it a second longer." Thrisk found his voice again, and when it came out, it wasn't a regulation and it wasn't a demand. It was smaller than that and truer. "How many of you are there, out here, wearing this?" She glanced at him, and for once there was no performance in her face at all, no bureaucratic patience worn thin, just a flat, tired kind of honesty that scared him worse than anything the battle had shown him yet. "More than your authority has ever bothered to count." The lead Vorus cruiser began to pull back. It wasn't a retreat, not fully, not yet. It was the kind of movement a predator makes when it starts to suspect the thing it cornered was never actually cornered at all. "They're reforming," Sealers called out, "trying to bracket us from 2 flanks." "Let them try," Odessa said, and finally, her hand came down on the console, cold and unhurried. "Rhea, bring the core online." Somewhere beneath their feet, something ancient and patient woke all the way up. It took less than a breath to spin up and centuries to arrive. Odessa reached for the carafe bolted beside the console, the one that had been rattling since the first alarm and never once spilled, and poured herself a half cup of recycled water she had no intention of drinking. It was such a small, ordinary motion that Thrisk almost missed it entirely, his eyes still fixed on the tactical display, on 7 ships bracketing wide for a strike that would never land. Then she set the cup down, untouched, and tapped the sequence. The command console lit her face in predatory amber. She didn't shout orders. She didn't brace for impact. She simply uncapped the core and fed raw, bleeding physics down into the external mining arrays, and for one suspended second, the whole ship seemed to hold its breath with her. The beam wasn't light. It was an absence of everything light usually meant. It struck the lead Vorus dreadnought and erased its midsection clean. No fire, no explosion, just a wound too clean and too total for the eye to process as violence at all. The flagship didn't detonate. It simply stopped being one ship and became two, drifting apart in eerie silence as its atmosphere fires guttered out in the vacuum between them. On the Vorus command channel, still bleeding faintly into the Rustlark's receivers, 3 separate voices screamed the same order in 3 different dialects at the exact same instant, a chorus of command structure collapsing all at once. Thrisk watched it happen and made no sound at all. Odessa turned from the display and looked at the wreckage with the flat, unbothered patience of an accountant closing a ledger that had finally balanced. "You have locked targeting sensors on a civilian vessel," she said, to no one who could hear her, to the empty space where the flagship used to be. "We consider this a formal invitation to escalate." The remaining 6 ships didn't escalate, they broke. It wasn't a coordinated retreat. It was 6 separate crews making 6 separate decisions to run, all at once, engines flaring wide and uneven as pilots who had spent the last 5 minutes hunting a freighter discovered, too late, that the freighter had simply been waiting to stop being polite. "They're scattering," Sealers called up. "No formation left at all." "Good," Odessa said. "Makes the targeting easier." She didn't reach for the core dial again. She didn't need to. What followed wasn't a battle anymore, and everyone aboard the Rustlark seemed to understand that at the same moment, the crew moving through it, with the bored efficiency of people finishing a job they'd started hours ago and were mildly annoyed, had run this long. She struck, she scattered, she stranded. 3 of the 6 fleeing cruisers lost drive output within the first 20 seconds, precise cuts through their engine housings that left the hulls intact, and the crews inside very much alive, tumbling helpless and furious into the dark. A 4th tried to bracket wide and found its weapons array sheared clean off before it completed the turn. By the time the last 2 ships gave up any pretense of an organized withdrawal, the whole engagement had gone quiet except for the low hum of the Rustlark's reactor settling back toward idle. Thrisk slid down the bulkhead until he was sitting on the deck plating, his datapad still lying forgotten where he'd dropped it, and stared at the tactical display without seeing it anymore. 90 seconds, he said to no one. That was 90 seconds. Nobody corrected him. Nobody needed to. Odessa knelt, picked his datapad up off the floor, and set it gently back in his lap. It was such a small, human gesture that it took him a full moment to understand she'd done it at all. "You're not haulers," he said again, quieter this time, no accusation left in it, just the wreckage of every assumption he'd carried aboard the ship 6 minutes into a routine audit. "The freight pays for the fuel," Odessa said, crouching to his eye level. "The quiet pays for my temper. Same answer as before, Inspector. You just weren't ready to hear it the first time." Below decks, she heard the reactor shackles groan back into place, Garrick's hands already rethreading the compliance bypass she'd shown him years ago, folding the singularity core back down into something that would read, on any VTA scanner, as a stubborn coolant fault. The ship would limp again by the time it reached the next checkpoint. That was the point. That had always been the point. "How many?" Thrisk said. He wasn't asking about the Vorus anymore. "How many ships like this one are running the same routes I've certified?" Odessa didn't answer that directly. She stood, straightened her jacket, and glanced toward the viewport, where the drifting wreckage of a fleet that had come looking for easy prey now hung dead and humiliated in the dark. "Some monsters sleep," she said, Ours just took civilian contracts. She offered him a hand up. After a long moment, he took it. The walk back to the airlock took longer than the boarding had, mostly because Thrisk kept stopping, staring at ordinary things, a wrench, a sleeping woman's empty canister, a headset tuned to nothing, and seeing them differently now, the way a person looks at a familiar room after learning it has a hidden floor beneath the one they'd always walked on. At the airlock, Odessa handed him a cup of synthetic nutrient broth, steaming faintly as if she were seeing off a colleague after a long, uneventful shift. "For the trip back," she said, "should still be warm when you file your report." He took it, his hands had mostly stopped shaking. "What do I even write?" "Whatever's true, we didn't break a single regulation you can point to. Ship ran hot, that's all. You'll find the paperwork in order." He looked at her for a long moment, the cup steaming between his palms, and something in his posture had changed permanently in a way no amount of breather calibration would fix. This sector's manifest lists over 4,000 independent haulers on this route alone. Odessa said nothing. She didn't need to. The glass pendant at her throat caught the airlock's harsh working light, and for the first time since he'd boarded, Thrisk noticed it properly, the pressed lily inside it perfectly still, untouched by every alarm, every impact, every shudder that had run through the deck plating beneath both their boots for the last hour. It hadn't moved once, not during the slug, not during the core discharge, not now. He stepped through the airlock without finishing the thought aloud, because he no longer had the paperwork to hold it. The Rustlark sealed its hatch behind him and drifted back onto its lazy, rumbling, deliberately unremarkable heading, one more tired freighter among thousands crawling the same dark roads, indistinguishable from any other unless someone made the very expensive mistake of looking closer. Odessa returned to the bridge, sat down at the console, and let the ship's old sluggish hum settle back around her like a coat she'd taken off for an hour and was glad to put back on. Garrick's voice came up from below, casual as ever. "Logs are clean, Captain. Nothing on record but a coolant fault and a delayed shipment." "Good," she said. She looked out at the drifting wreckage one last time, 6 broken hulls tumbling slow and silent in the black, crews alive inside them and utterly changed by what they now knew. Somewhere out past that wreckage, past the checkpoint Thrisk was already limping toward, with a story no regulation had a form for, thousands more ships like hers ran the same quiet routes, wearing the same tired paint, waiting on the same patient math. "We paved the trade routes," she thought, "because we are the only ones who know what's buried underneath them." The glass pendant hung still against her collarbone, a fragile monument anchored at the center of an engineered slaughter, and outside the viewport the wreckage kept drifting, unclaimed, into the dark.